Imagine a world in the late Ice Age, 50 or 60,000 years ago, when sea levels were up to 120 meters lower and entire coastlines didn't even exist yet. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania weren't separate. They were fused into one supercontinent called Sahul, and at some point, humans crossed open ocean to reach it. The only question is, when? 65,000 years ago, like the archaeology says, or 50,000, like the DNA says. That is what we are going to uncover today. Make sure to not miss a thing. Geographers call it Sahul. This vast Ice Age landmass stretched from tropical rainforests in the north to temperate grasslands in the south, from arid deserts in the interior to rich coastal plains now drowned beneath ocean waves. It was a world of megafauna, giant wombats, marsupial lions, enormous flightless birds. An ecosystem unlike anywhere else on Earth. And at some point, tens of thousands of years ago, humans arrived, not by accident, not by drifting on logs, but by deliberate seafaring, crossing open water from island Southeast Asia, moving through a chain of islands called Wallacea, likely touching down on stepping stones like Timor or Seram before making the final push to Sahul's northern shores. That journey, regardless of when it happened, represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, because it required planning, navigation, watercraft capable of carrying people across dozens of kilometers of open ocean. It implies cognitive sophistication, social organization, and a willingness to venture into the unknown. But here's the question that has divided archaeologists, geneticists, and indigenous communities for decades. When exactly did humans first reach Sahul? And are the people who made that first crossing the ancestors of today's Aboriginal Australians? For years, the dominant headline has been 65,000 years, a date that, if correct, would make Aboriginal Australians not only among the world's oldest continuous cultures, but also pioneers who reached and settled an entire continent earlier than Homo sapiens reached most of Europe or the Americas, a date that would rewrite the human story. But in 2025, DNA is telling a different story, and the clash between archaeology and genetics is forcing us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the first Australians. The 65,000-year claim comes from a single site, Majid Bebe, a rock shelter in Australia's Northern Territory. In 2017, archaeologists working at the site published groundbreaking results. They reported stone tools, ground ochre, plant processing grindstones, edge-ground hatchet fragments, and other cultural material in what they said were intact, datable sediment layers deep beneath the shelter's floor. Using a technique called optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL, which measures when sand grains were last exposed to sunlight, they dated the lowest artifact-bearing layers to around 65,000 years before present. The implications were staggering. If people were living at Majid Bebe 65,000 years ago, it meant humans had crossed to Sahul far earlier than most experts believe possible. It pushed back the timeline for Australia's settlement by 15 to 20,000 years compared to other well-dated sites. The findings made global headlines. Aboriginal elders and community representatives pointed to the research as confirmation of their oral traditions, which speak of a presence on the land stretching back to time immemorial, to the dreaming itself. For many, 65,000 years wasn't a surprise. It was validation. But in science, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And from the moment the Majid Bebe date was published, critics raised concerns. The problem, they argued, was the site itself. Majid Bebe sits on deep, mobile sands, loose sediments that shift and flow over time, and in such contexts, post-depositional processes can drive artifacts downward through the layers, carrying stone tools from younger deposits into older sediments below. If that happened at Majid Bebe, it would produce artificially old ages. The tools might be 20 or 30,000 years old, but the sand they're buried in could be 65,000 years old. Dating the sand doesn't necessarily date the tools. Critics also pointed out that Majid Bebe was an outlier. Almost every other well-dated Australian site clusters between about 45,000 and 50,000 years ago. Sites on Australia's once exposed northwest continental shelf, sites in the interior deserts, sites in the southeast near the Willandra Lakes. All of them show human occupation beginning around 50,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years. Why would Majid Bebe be so much older than everywhere else? If people reached Australia 65,000 years ago, where are the other sites from that period? Why isn't there a scatter of 60,000-year-old sites across the continent? Supporters of the 65,000-year date fought back. They argued they had tracked artifact refits, pieces of stone that fit back together, proving the tools hadn't moved through the sediments. They ran multiple dating programs using different techniques. They documented sophisticated behaviors like grinding seed foods and using pigments, behaviors that signal cognitively modern humans. But even archaeologists sympathetic to the Majed Bebe team admitted the site was problematic, a single data point that needed independent verification from other sites of similar antiquity. And that verification hasn't come. Not yet. Majed Bebe remains alone, an isolated claim of extraordinary age in a continent where most evidence points to a younger settlement. So for years, the debate simmered. Archaeology couldn't resolve it. One camp believed 65,000 years. The other remained skeptical, favoring dates closer to 50,000 years. It was a standoff. And then DNA entered the picture. In 2025, researchers from La Trobe University in Australia and the University of Utah in the United States published a study that approached the question from a completely different angle. Instead of digging for artifacts, they looked at genomes. Specifically, the genomes of living Aboriginal Australians and other populations around the world. What they found was a genetic signature that functions like a timestamp, a molecular clock that constrains when the ancestors of today's Aboriginal Australians could have reached Sahul. The key is Neanderthal DNA. All living people outside sub-Saharan Africa, including Aboriginal Australians, Papuans, Europeans, Asians, everyone, carry roughly 2% Neanderthal ancestry in their genomes. That Neanderthal DNA didn't appear randomly. It came from interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, when our ancestors migrated out of Africa and encountered Neanderthal populations living in Eurasia. But here's what recent large-scale genome studies have revealed. This Neanderthal ancestry appears to come from a single pulse of interbreeding, one major episode, not repeated mixing over tens of thousands of years across vast regions, but a relatively narrow window of contact that happens somewhere in Western Eurasia, most likely the Levant or Near East, between about 51,500 and 43,500 years ago. In other words, modern humans leaving Africa mixed with Neanderthals during that specific period acquired Neanderthal DNA and then carried that genetic signal with them as they dispersed across the rest of the world. And Aboriginal Australians carry that same Neanderthal signal at levels comparable to other non-African populations, which means their ancestors were part of that admixture event. They were in Eurasia, available to interbreed with Neanderthals during that 51 to 43,000 year window. But if that's true, then the ancestors of today's Aboriginal Australians couldn't have reached Sahul 65,000 years ago, because that would place them on Sahul before the Neanderthal interbreeding event. And people who left Africa and reached Sahul before mixing with Neanderthals wouldn't carry Neanderthal DNA. But every modern Aboriginal Australian does carry it. Which means, under this model, that the founding population, the ancestors of living communities, established itself in Sahul after the Neanderthal admixture pulse, around 50,000 years ago, not 65,000. The genetic team goes further. They argue this Neanderthal signal functions like a genetic timestamp, locking the founding settlement date closer to 50,000 years than 65,000. And that date aligns with the archaeological sites that cluster between 45,000 and 50,000 years ago. Sites like Booty Cave on Barrow Island off Western Australia, where coastal hunter-gatherers left food remains and stone tools around 50,000 years ago. Widjingarri 1 and other rock shelters on the Kimberley coast, indicating occupation beginning roughly 50,000 years ago. Carnatukul, also known as Serpent's Glen in the Western Desert, where people were making half-did microlithic tools and adapting to extreme inland conditions by at least 45,000 years ago. And the Willandra Lakes region in southeastern Australia, including Lake Mungo, where ritual burials show culturally complex behaviour around 40 to 42,000 years ago. Mungo Man, whose body was sprinkled with red ochre in a ceremonial burial. These aren't just archaeological sites, they're evidence of symbolic thought, ritual practice, spiritual beliefs, the kind of behaviour you'd expect from the ancestors of a continuous culture stretching to the present. So, if genetics says 50,000 years, and most archaeology says 45 to 50,000 years, What do we make of Majed Baby's 65,000-year claim? One possibility is that Majed Baby is simply wrong, that the artifacts really did move through the sediments, that post-depositional processes compromise the site, that the tools are younger than the sand they're buried in. But there's another possibility, one that's more complicated and, in some ways, more intriguing. What if there really was an earlier wave of humans who reached Sahul around 60 or 65,000 years ago, a pioneer population? Small, isolated. They spread across the Ice Age landscape when Sahul was a single connected landmass, living on coastal plains now drowned by rising seas, leaving traces at Majid Bebe and perhaps other sites we haven't found or can't access. But then, sometime later, a second, larger wave arrived, around 50,000 years ago. This group carried the Neanderthal DNA signature. They brought sophisticated technology, symbolic culture, organized social structures. And over time, this later, larger population either replaced, absorbed, or genetically swamped the earlier arrivals. In this scenario, the first humans in Sahul and the ancestors of living Aboriginal Australians are not necessarily the same founding population. The genetic continuity we see today traces back 50,000 years, but there might have been people on Sahul before that whose genetic legacy was lost. Geneticists counter that if such an early wave existed, it left no detectable trace in modern genomes. Every Aboriginal Australian alive today carries the Neanderthal and Denisovan admixture signatures consistent with a post-50,000-year arrival. If an earlier, separate population existed, where did their genes go? But archaeologists push back. No detectable legacy yet isn't the same as it never happened. Ancient DNA recovery in Australia is technically and ethically complex. Many indigenous communities oppose destructive sampling of ancestral remains, and even when permission is granted, the hot, humid climate degrades DNA rapidly. Successful ancient DNA extraction from Australian skeletons is rare. More importantly, vast portions of Pleistocene Sahul's landscape are now underwater. When sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, the ocean flooded continental shelves, drowning hundreds of kilometers of coastal plains. Those coastal zones were likely where early humans first landed, where they lived and thrived for millennia, and now they're gone, submerged under 60 to 120 meters of water, inaccessible to archaeologists. If key early sites exist, they're on drowned shelves off northern Australia, off the Kimberley coast, off the Arafura Plain that once connected Australia to New Guinea. So the absence of 65,000-year-old sites might not mean people weren't there. It might just mean we can't find them yet. But there's one more piece of evidence that might tip the scales, and it comes from just north of Sahul in present-day Indonesia. On the island of Sulawesi, archaeologists recently made a stunning discovery. Cave art. Not just abstract marks or handprints, but figurative art. Full narrative scenes. Tyranthropes, human-animal hybrid figures. Wild pigs, hunting scenes. And using new laser-based uranium series dating methods on mineral crusts that formed over the paint, they dated the oldest panels to at least 51,200 years ago. That makes it the oldest known storytelling art in the world. The oldest complex, symbolic depiction. Evidence of myth-making, narrative thought, cultural transmission, the kind of cognitive sophistication that defines modern human behavior. And it's in Ireland, Southeast Asia, right on the doorstep of Sahul at 51,000 years ago. That timing is significant. It shows that by more than 50,000 years ago, humans living in the islands immediately upstream of Sahul were cognitively modern, socially complex, and almost certainly capable of organized maritime travel. They were making art, telling stories, creating symbolic representations of their world. This cultural sophistication fits perfectly with a major human expansion into Sahul around 50,000 years ago. People carrying both symbolic culture and the Neanderthal ancestry signature, equipped with the cognitive and technological tools to cross open water, navigate unknown seas, and colonize a new continent. It also suggests that the window for human arrival on Sahul might be narrower than the 65,000-year claim suggests. If sophisticated symbolic culture emerges in Wallacea around 51,000 years ago, and the major founding population of Sahul arrives with that same cultural package shortly thereafter, it argues for a clustered, relatively rapid colonization rather than a gradual, piecemeal process stretching back tens of thousands of years earlier. So, Where does that leave us? With archaeology and genetics in tension, each pointing to different timelines, different narratives, different answers to the question of when humans first reached Sahul. The genetic evidence is clear. All living Aboriginal Australians carry a Neanderthal admixture signature that dates to between 51 and 43,000 years ago. That signature functions as a timestamp, anchoring the ancestry of modern communities to a post-admixture dispersal. Under this model, the founding settlement that gave rise to today's Aboriginal Australians happened around 50,000 years ago. The archaeological evidence is more complicated. Most sites cluster between 45 and 50,000 years ago, supporting the genetic timeline. But Majid Baby stands apart, claiming 65,000 years and refusing to be dismissed entirely. The synthesis that's emerging among many researchers is this: the major, successful, ancestry-bearing peopling of Sahul happened around 50,000 years ago. That's when the ancestors of living Aboriginal Australians arrived, bringing Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, symbolic culture, sophisticated technology, and the cognitive and social structures necessary to colonize an entire continent. But it's possible, maybe even likely, that there were earlier, smaller groups who reached Sahul before that. Pioneer populations who left limited traces, whose genetic legacy was either lost or overwhelmed by later arrivals. Majid Bebe might represent one of those early incursions, or it might be a problematic site with compromised stratigraphy. The jury is still out. What's certain is that the story of Australia's first people is more complex than a single date can capture. It's not just 65,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago, it's a process, a series of events. Waves of migration, adaptation, interaction, survival. The genetics tells us about ancestry, about who the ancestors of living people were and when they arrived. The archaeology tells us about behavior, about how people lived and adapted and spread across the landscape. The environmental science tells us about opportunity, about when sea levels and climate created windows for migration. And the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians tell us about continuity, about a presence on the land that stretches back beyond memory, into the dreaming, into the time when the world and the people were made together. Archaeology and oral tradition and the land itself tells a story of human achievement that few other cultures can match. The story of the first Australians, the pioneers of Sahul, the ancestors who crossed the sea and never looked back. If you are interested in more Australian history, make sure to check out this video about Mungo Man.